your microphone is on up there. You want to test the microphone and see what it's like? See, I don't forget. Thank you, John.
I preached in small country congregations for about 30 years, almost 30 years. When some people look at small congregations, they feel sorry for them. When I look at small congregations, I see a few brave, dedicated people. And I commend all of you for your dedication. I know that I go down to East Side and I'm surrounded by 200 people, and we get a little bit too comfortable when we're a larger congregation. We think everything is just wonderful. But when we're on the front line, like you folks are, and you know that everything depends on your being there and attending and taking part, it's a feeling that I get. I know we get mixed emotions about, but I admire, having been in small congregations for so many years, I admire your dedication, and I want you to keep it up. We're going to take up where we left off Wednesday, in Romans chapter 1. Wednesday, we learned that Paul was eager to carry the message of the gospel to Rome. In the text that we read, he discussed several reasons for this eagerness. I talked about two of these reasons Wednesday. First, he was eager because of the faith that the Roman Christians had already demonstrated. Evidently, the faith of the Roman Christians was something that was being talked about all over the known world. Look at what he said in Romans 1, verse 8. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Second, he was eager to go and preach in Rome because it would give him opportunity to establish or strengthen or fortify these Roman Christians. In verse 11, he said, "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established." Now, we don't know the nature of this spiritual gift that Paul wanted to impart to them, but we do know that the purpose of that gift was to strengthen the faith of those Christians in the face of the enemies of Christianity, pagans as well as the Jews. One commentator put it this way: the object of bestowing spiritual gifts was that they might be taught more thoroughly the will of God, that they might be strengthened in the faith and be firm and steadfast, And it was to this end that Paul desired to impart to them some spiritual gift, that they might be more confirmed in the truth of God. Today, I want to begin this lesson with a discussion of the other three reasons Paul gave for being eager to come to Rome. The fourth reason that he was eager was because of the fellowship that he desperately needed. Paul probably knew that his statement in verse 11 might be taken in the wrong way, that it might look as if he saw himself as the one who was giving his support because of his presence there, and that the Roman Christians were just getting all the benefits from his being with him. And so, he quickly added in verse 12, that is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. In other words, Paul was saying, I long to see you because it will not only help you, it will also help me. He later said that he hoped to find refreshing rest in their company. One commentator said, Paul knew about the reciprocal blessings of Christian fellowship. And although he was an apostle, he was not too proud to acknowledge his need of it. Happy is the one who goes into another country and culture to preach, and who receives the same reception that he would in his own country. He is anxious to receive as well as to give. He's anxious to learn as well as to teach. He is anxious to be encouraged as well as to encourage. And happy is the congregation who have leaders of the same humble mind. David Lipscomb commented on this verse by saying, their faith would be a source of comfort to him, and his spiritual power would be a help and strengthen to them. Paul realized that edification was not a one-way street. I've come to realize that in my years of preaching and teaching, through the years, I've been greatly encouraged by, and yes, I have learned much from those with whom I have worked, taught, and preached. As I try my best to do some things that would bless people and help them to understand spiritual things, things that I do through the column that I write on Facebook, things that the opportunities I have to preach and teach. At the same time, though, I am constantly strengthened by those who support me with their comments and their encouragements. The point I think Paul is trying to make here is that we need each other as Christians. We need to worship together. We need to work together. We need to even have social activities together. It helps us to lift our voice together with others in praise. It encourages us to see others faithfully serving the Lord. It strengthens us to hear how others are meeting tribulation with the help of God. Have you ever stood in front of a blazing fire where the coals are all pressed together and keeping that fire going? What happens if you pull one of those coals aside, away from the fire, it soon grows cold and black. Something not unlike that occurs when one Christian separates himself from the company of his fellow Christians. One reason God established the church is that He knew how much we need the support of others to live the Christian life. Paul here was telling these Roman Christians just how much their support meant to them, to him. But still another reason Paul was eager to come to the Roman Christians was because of the fruit that he desired. In verse 13, Paul gave still another reason that he wanted to go to Rome and preach. Now, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also. The saving souls was the primary purpose of Paul's preaching the gospel. The word translated, preach the gospel, is the word from which we get evangelize. Paul had an evangelistic purpose in going to Rome. Now, he had been blessed bountifully with a harvest of souls throughout the eastern part of the Roman Empire, but he longed for the same kind of fruit in Rome itself. Fifth and finally, Paul was eager to go to Rome because he felt that he had a debt to repay. In verse 14, he says, I'm a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. Now, naming the categories of Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish, this was Paul's way of saying, I'm under obligation to everybody. Now, most societies have labels that distinguish between us and not us, or them. The Jews used the terms Jews and Gentiles. The Romans spoke of Romans and heathens. For the Greeks, it was Greeks and barbarians. In Paul's day, the Greeks were world famous for their culture and refinement. The barbarians, on the other hand, were not noted for being cultured and refined. In fact, the word barbarian is a Greek word transliterated into an English word. It was a word which, to the Grecian ear, reflected the harsh, unintelligible sound of foreign languages. And using the terms Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish, Paul was probably emphasizing his obligation to the culture and to the uncultured, to the educated and to the uneducated, his obligation to all people. One commentator stated, God had redeemed and saved Paul that he might preach to the Gentiles. He was, therefore, under obligation both to God, who entrusted the gospel to him, and to those to whom it was entrusted. He was obligated to proclaim it to all within his reach. He was a steward of the mysteries of God. Therefore, his efforts to do them good are but a discharge of a duty to God and to them. Now, that word translated debtor here refers to owing something to another. It alludes to an outstanding debt. One translation of the end of verse 14 says, I have an obligation to discharge. I have a duty to perform. I have a debt to pay. Now, how had Paul incurred this debt? Paul didn't primarily have in mind the kind of debt that results from person A loaning something to person B, so that person B is indebted to person A until that debt is repaid. Rather, Paul's debt was the kind incurred when person A gives person B something to give to person C. In this case, person B is in debt until he passes it on that which really belongs to person C. Now, for instance, if somebody gave me a sum of money to give to you, I couldn't keep that money for myself. I would be obligated morally, ethically, and legally to give that money to you. Well, this is how it worked. Christ, person A, had given the gospel to Paul, person B. And now Paul was obligated to share that gospel with others, person C. We are also all under that obligation. Now, Paul considered his past. He could think of many to whom he was indebted. In the providence of God, he had a Jewish heritage, a Greek education, and Roman citizenship. Above all, though, he would have recognized his indebtedness to the Lord. Let's look at what Paul wrote in Romans 5, beginning at verse 6. In Romans 5, starting at verse 6, he wrote, and I want to put this in first person so that Paul appears to be talking about himself. For when I was still without strength, in due time Christ died for me. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man some would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward me, in that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, I shall be saved from wrath through him. For when I was some enemies, I was reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, I shall be saved by his life. Above all, what affected Paul was the wondrous fact that Jesus had not only saved him, but he had also entrusted him with a gospel that is God's power to save. Romans 1, verse 16. Christ had given him the good news so that others might come to the Lord and they might receive the same blessings he had enjoyed and continued to enjoy. Paul felt deeply the obligation that he had. It became the focus of his life. It became the reason for his being. He wrote to the Corinthian Christians in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 16 and 17. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. Paul felt deeply his debt to all people everywhere, regardless of their social standing, regardless of their financial status, regardless of their educational level, regardless of their ethnic background, or their age, or their gender. Paul preached to kings and governors, but he also reached out to the lowly. He became all things to all men, so that he might by all means save some. And so, he made this statement in Romans 1, in verse 15. So, as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. The word ready or eager, that expresses willingness. One commentator said, at the time of writing the Roman epistle, Paul had been actively engaged in his ministry for almost 30 hectic, energy-sapping years. He had endured enough hardship and had been exposed to enough trauma and excitement to last most people for half a dozen lifetimes. Nevertheless, Paul's enthusiasm for preaching had in no way abated. We cannot read of Paul's earnest desire to go to Rome and preach without at least wondering, am I as eager to share the gospel as he was? It's been said that Paul considered teaching others an obligation, a debt, while sometimes we think of it only as an option. I know, because I'm guilty of that kind of thinking too often myself. We need to understand that we too are obligated to the lost. Like Paul, we owe so much to so many, to all who have taught us, and to all who made us what we are. Above all, we are eternally indebted to the one who loved us and gave himself up for us. Ephesians 5, verse 2. It is he who entrusts us with the gospel to take it to all the world. Now, if our neighbor was starving, we had food, would we not be obligated to share it with him? If we possessed the cure for some terrible disease, wouldn't we be obligated to share it with the suffering world? How much more is our obligation? How much obligation should we feel to share that which can save the souls of men? I need to emphasize again that our obligation is to all people. Now, we're more comfortable around those who are like us, but our concern cannot, it must not, stop there. We must never lose sight of the debt that we owe both to the Greeks and barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. We're all in agreement that debts should be paid. In our country, in fact, we've derogatory designations for those who try to avoid paying their debts. Things like they're deadbeats. But at the same time, we ought not to expect to be praised for just paying our debts. Jesus said in Luke 17, verse 10, "So likewise you, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do." We're not at liberty to choose whether or not we shall do it or not. We're simply being dishonest if we don't. Do we feel a debt for the lost? Are we striving to pay that debt? Are we as eager to share the gospel with others as Paul was? Now, we may be aware of our debt. We may feel obligated to teach others. However, are we eager to do so as Paul was? Often, those most obligated seem to be the least eager. We may be reluctant or fearful or even indifferent. Sometimes we're anything but eager. There are many reasons that we should be eager, but the most important reason is because of what the gospel will do for others. It will save their souls. It will give them strength in this life. It will prepare them for the life to come. But we should also be eager to share the gospel with others because of what this will do for us. We will have more appreciation for what the Lord has done for us and continues to do for us. We will have the joy of seeing souls saved and strengthened. We will have a great satisfaction in knowing that we are doing what the Lord has asked us to do. And we will have hearts like those of Paul and others who burn with zeal for the lost. Once we grasp the message of Romans and apply it to our own hearts, we too should feel an obligation to teach others the gospel, and we should do so with eagerness. Like Paul, we will say what Paul said in Romans 1, verse 16. "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for those who believe, the Jews first, and also to the Greeks." We will not only say that or believe that, we will truly mean it. Does anybody have a comment or a question on the lesson this morning?